The world is at war. World War II has broken out in Europe as the Axis powers take over Poland and France. But halfway around the world, China has been fighting Japanese aggression alone since 1937. Unable to conquer China, Japan decides to expand the war to the Pacific. On the morning of the 7th of December 1941, Japanese aircraft launched a surprise attack on the US Pacific Fleet in Hawaii. Within 2 hours, they've sunk 5 battleships, 188 aircraft, and killed over 2,400 American troops. It is a scene of utter destruction, a defining moment that shocks the United States.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
That day, the United States enters World War II. This is a turning point for China. It's no longer fighting the war alone. My name is Rana Mitter, Oxford professor and a historian of modern China. I've spent years researching and writing about China's World War II, a conflict that raged longer than Europe's and was just as devastating. I'm traveling across China to find the last few remaining survivors. And find out what memories remain from the war. To reveal the true stories of China's struggle to survive against all odds. And how victory helped forge China into what it is today. For many Americans, World War II started at Pearl Harbor in 1941. For the Europeans, it started in 1939, when Germany invaded Poland. However, China and Japan had already been at war since 1937. In October 1938, Japan had control over much of northern and central China, including its major cities, Beijing, Tianjin, Shanghai, Nanjing, and Wuhan. Their troops were advancing west towards southwestern China. Their aim, to capture Chongqing. One of the fastest growing urban centers in the world, with over 30 million people, Chongqing is also one of China's most populous cities. But the city was almost left in ruins during the Second World War. Perched between mountains, covered in fog, it's a real inland fortress and will be extremely difficult for any enemy to capture by land. It was the perfect choice for the nationalists' wartime capital.
And then the people rose and moved.
When the government moved here, so did schools, factories, and millions of refugees from the occupied areas. From 1938, the wartime capital became a symbol of China's resistance. Residents and refugees supported the nation's economic and wartime demands by manufacturing bullets, weapons, and textiles. But the hills surrounding the city offered only meager protection against Japan's Imperial Air Force. On May the 3rd and 4th, 1939, air raids killed close to 4,000 people and left 5,411 houses destroyed in the first 48 hours alone. People began moving underground for safety as the city of Chongqing was set alight.
This
This restaurant is actually one of the bomb shelters that remains in Chongqing to this day. During the war years, this city had more air raid shelters than any other in China. Over 1,000 of them, in fact. The Japanese wanted to bomb the government and its people into submission, and many perished during the attacks.
In June 1941, thousands suffocated in a shelter as they fled from a day of relentless Japanese air raids. As a member of the air raid rescue team during the war, 92-year-old Gao Rongbin witnessed the tragedy firsthand and is still haunted by it today.
Tell me what you remember about the bombing on the 5th of June 1941.
5点钟就动着，大概5点多钟飞机来了，6点钟来了。那进门的时候我红灯了，解除是那路的。你说听着声呐，5、6点钟才解除。你看那个人在里头，啷个遭得住嘛？时间久了要你熬我熬的。衣服那些你穿我的衣服不穿衣服，给烂了。衣服都裤儿衣服都没穿，有些是光的，有些穿件衣服，有些穿裤的，有些摇裤穿起的。那个18天那个洞时，那个门呐，就往里头开，人一拢多了，就把那个门挤到了，开不过来。尸体啊，哎呀，是臭那么多这个味儿没？这个在房子边去进去啊，你别人家抬不到好多。我尽是晚上抬，在那3年3夜。这个时候我抓到一个抬了个小姑娘10几岁，光看见到的，我们看到都当时都哭了。我跟右边2个孙都哭啊，都掉眼泪。你们那个衣服给他打倒，好残忍呐！
Listening to Mr. Gao's story brought home just how desperate people must have been that terrible night in the air raid shelter. They had nowhere else to go to protect themselves from that air raid. And it brought to mind that war does affect everybody, but it affects different people in different ways.
By 1941, there were only enough shelters built to protect around 2/3 of the population. People piled in for safety even when they were overcrowded. The shelter where thousands suffocated is located in downtown Chongqing at Jiaochangkou.
I feel like I'm in the world's gloomiest cathedral, but actually this is the biggest of the air raid shelters that was built in Chongqing during the war. It's big, 2.5 kilometers in length, and it's broad, about 4 meters at its widest. So on my own, it does feel empty, but I can't imagine what it would have been like with thousands of refugees here, panicked, sweaty. Even now, there's a sort of warm, damp atmosphere that I do find quite disturbing.
The bombings on Chongqing would last for more than 5 years, until the 23rd of August 1943. 4 years longer than the infamous German Blitz on the United Kingdom that lasted for a devastating year in 1941. During the most intense bombing period, between May 1938 and August 1941, the city of Chongqing was subjected to over 218 air raids. These missions killed nearly 12,000 people and wounded thousands more. It was imperative for the Chinese to hold on to the West and for Chongqing, the wartime capital, not to fall. Though much of the city was reduced to debris, the Chinese continued their resistance.
Japan had occupied most of China's major eastern seaports and railway lines. The country was becoming cut off from the outside world. To maintain an armed resistance, China needed aid and supplies from the outside world. And the best plan seemed to be to build a new road from Yunnan across the border to Burma.
But it was a near impossible challenge. To build more than 1,000 kilometers of road through remote mountains and jungle. And if they didn't succeed, the resistance could grind to a halt and the whole country fall under Japanese rule.
I'm in Yunnan province in western China, and I'm discovering what happened here in 1937. Japan had invaded China and occupied the prosperous eastern parts of the country. So a road had to be built between this province and Burma, 1,000 kilometers to the west. But who was going to build it?
With most eligible men fighting in the army, some unlikely candidates answered the government's plea for help. Labourers, including the elderly, women and children, used primitive tools to carve out the road. By the end of 1937, nearly 200,000 local labourers had been drafted. But time was against them. The government needed the road finished in just 12 months.
The Chinese did something that seemed impossible, and they did it in less than a year. They built a road stretching from Kunming, the capital of Yunnan, to Lashio in Burma. If they'd used machinery, it might have taken 3 years. But the Chinese used the only asset to hand: people.
The road provided a lifeline for China and a link to the outside world. But it was short-lived. In 1942, after the Pacific War broke out, Japan moved swiftly and invaded Southeast Asia, including Burma. They then made their way to Yunnan and occupied key towns along the Burma Road. China's lifeline had been severed.
An Air Transport Command plane takes off every 6 minutes.
The only reliable way to keep supplies flowing was by air. But because of the threat of Japanese airstrikes, an unconventional, more dangerous route was devised. Over the Himalayas, from Assam in India to China. With secret approval from President Franklin D. Roosevelt, a crew of discharged elite American pilots, officially known as the American Volunteer Group, was dispatched to support China's Air Force. They became known as the Flying Tigers, led by General Claire Lee Chennault. Chinese pilots were given the task of navigating the treacherous route. At high altitudes of 17,000 to 20,000 feet, the plane's engines could ice over and stall at any time. These dangerous flights came to be known as flying the hump. 99-year-old Dai Zhijin was one of the Chinese pilots who made that journey over the hump. At the age of 22, Dai responded to a recruitment ad for pilots. More than 70 years on, he still remembers his close shaves with death.
一般性呢，我们国逃工的是，叫飞机震荡是没危险的，主要问题是飞机假使出了问题，那就没办法了，因为这个地方都是山，没平地，你爬降没办法爬降的，下去就是完了。所谓逃工的危险就这样子了，你不能出问题，出了问题就没命。
From the end of 1941, Chinese pilots were sent to America for training. And Dai Zhijin was one of them. After he returned, Dai was roped in to support the Flying Tigers, later reorganized as the US 14th Air Force in China. One of their key missions was to destroy important Japanese supply lines.
1944年10月份大概是啊，我们从凉山到汉中，私下飞行到汉中，
邮局就下达任务，到机场中间交个生物炸王屋青条。王屋青条在以前呢14号可能去炸过了，但是没炸中。我们这到桥上面呢，日本人高射炮打得很厉害，他没想到我们是低空去炸，所以他的高射炮对我们不在乎这个高射炮，到主要在乎这个机关枪，一低空啊就怕机关枪。下去以后啊，我们速度很快的，从这个37英尺冲下去，一直冲到这个铁的桥面上。我们那个副队长着急了，一到这个桥这个桥头堡，就是刚进桥，他就把他的第3个就投了。我没投，我不投，我就要到中间去，所以呢，我一直到中间，我要调整这个飞机，不要叫它吃了。最后呢，我投了2个弹，投了2个弹。我叫我那个领航员呢，到旁边去看，炸中了没？领航员上去看了以后，炸中了，桥断了。那个时候我们这个思想还是糊里糊涂，有点稀里糊涂，我觉得是。炸了以后才知道，哎，蛮危险的，好像是吧？
Although the Flying Tigers boosted China's air defense and kept supplies flowing, the country needed more relief than just ammunition.
Supplies from across the Burma hump couldn't keep China's armies fed. They couldn't continue the resistance. So to solve the food problem, the nationalist government implemented a policy that would compound an already desperate situation.
In 1938, as a last-ditch effort to stall the Japanese from advancing towards the military command base at Wuhan, the nationalist government decided to break the Yellow River dikes.
The strategy succeeded. China did manage to trade space for time, but the decision also had disastrous consequences. The course of the Yellow River now flowed southeast instead of northeast, flooding large parts of Henan province and inundating its fertile plains. Other factors, a drought, a grain tax, also added to the impact of the flood.
Liu Haiyong is an academic who's been studying the impact of the famine in Henan during the war years.
本来在这个灾荒之年，按照这个救济百姓的这种方法啊，应该减少征收公粮、征粮啊，减少税负。但是，当时为了保证河南驻军的这种军粮，它不但没有减少，反而加重了这种粮食的赋税。在灾荒最严重的时候，有的人没有东西吃了，啥都没有了，又年老体迈，行动不便，他吃啥？我看到一则回忆录上，就是文史资料上记载的，他就是吃他的粪便。
People went to extreme lengths for food. Those who survived never forgot what happened during the famine. World War II has broken out. Starting with China in 1937, Japan has turned Asia and the Pacific into a battlefield. In an attempt to stall the Japanese from advancing towards their military command base, the nationalist government breaks the Yellow River dikes in 1938. But widespread devastation ensues in the following years.
I'm in Kaifeng, in Henan province, one of the most fertile regions of China, where grains like wheat feed millions of Chinese every year. But it was a very different scene in 1942. 3 million Chinese were starving to death.
To find out more and get a first-hand account, I'm meeting a survivor who lived through the famine in 1942. 88 years old now, Wang Yanchuan was a teenager in 1942. Conditions were harsh, and his family of 11 were forced to live at the local temple after selling their house.
What did your family do for food during the famine? What did you eat?
刚才我们说，俺都是吃那个就是树皮、树叶。有榆树外皮、老皮一去掉，光里头大草片扔剪子一绞，一晒干，那个棒子全碎，都搁锅里煮上，要搁盐，这糊涂我吃。这要让村里的树叶来完了，有个大榆树有别这房子还高，我到家我看有一个歪这个榆树歪，把一棵真长，一棵真出来。有留几个叶儿，我就在那边上来。我上吊道上，哎，真有个大长叶儿，我学够了，我这一个手扳着树，一捞摇，那个绳正转着，咬牙拴也没这办法。
You saw some absolutely horrific things during the famine. Could you describe some of them for us?
我听人说现在，到现在这个开封供电局那边有，现在百货大楼西南角那会儿卖人呢，一会儿谁男的媳妇要媳妇的，你拿点米面都中给他。他父母老都跟你走了，哎，也不用说多少钱呢。有了8个小孩就卖小孩哎，往那一坐都搁地下坐那会儿，跟那苦土，那小孩正的插一锅草，是不是就没有什么卖嘞
？Wang Yanchuan was 14 years old when the famine hit. He was a victim of a chain of circumstances, and suddenly he was eating bark from trees. The war was destroying the very fabric of humanity. The famine showed how desperate the situation was. As Chiang Kai-shek himself observed in his diary in 1943, if the war drags on more than a year, then China might not be able to sustain the situation much longer. On February the 18th, 1943, Madame Chiang Kai-shek went to the United States to rally support for the war against Japan. She addressed the U.S. House of Representatives.
China is eager and ready to cooperate with you and other peoples to lay a true and lasting foundation for a sane and progressive world society which would make it impossible for any arrogant or predatory neighbor to plunge future generations into another orgy of blood.
She won them over with her charisma and helped pave the way for China's inclusion in talks about the ending of World War II. But the political reality was much less rosy. Even before the talks began, there was deep mistrust between the Allies. In 1943, a conference was called in Cairo to discuss the future of the war against Japan. This was the first conference attended by the leaders of the 3 principal Allied countries with a stake in the Asia-Pacific theatres of war. Roosevelt for the United States, Churchill for the British Empire, and Chiang Kai-shek for China. As Chiang observed in his diary, it was my first appearance on the diplomatic stage. The alliance was fragile because its members had very different objectives. The United States and Britain wanted to focus on the war in the Pacific because the Japanese were threatening the British position in Southeast Asia. The war in Europe, at their back door, was threatening to overwhelm China. But despite their differences, they did reach a resolution. The Allies agreed on a united front to resist Japanese aggression and strip Japan of many territories acquired in the Pacific, China, and Korea. And back at home, with the support of the Allies, China could now reclaim a key piece of territory.
Chinese survival depended on opening the road between Yunnan and Burma to allow supplies through. The strategy was a two-pronged attack from Ledo in India and southwestern Yunnan into northern Burma. But they couldn't do it alone. They needed the Allies to provide more ground support, and when they didn't get it, they had a difficult decision to make.
Because of new priorities in Europe, the Allies provided very little ground support. Despite this, China decided to attack the Japanese bases in western Yunnan and drive them out of key towns along the Burma Road.
I'm in Tengchong, in Yunnan, near the border with Burma. And it was here, in 1944, that a crucial battle took place to secure the famous Burma Road, China's lifeline to the outside world.
The Japanese conquered Rangoon, the capital of Burma, in March 1942. To hold back the Japanese onslaught in Burma, the British fought back, supported by their Chinese allies. Despite the alliance, they lost Lashio, the start of the Burma Road, a month later. China needed to end the blockade of Burma and build a new supply route connecting them to India. But first, they had to drive the Japanese out of Tengchong.
This is one of China's best-preserved World War II cemeteries, and it's filled with soldiers who died at the Battle of Tengchong in 1944. They were members of the Chinese Expeditionary Force. Among their number, 10,000 elite troops who were trained by the Americans in Yunnan and in India. Known by their code names of X and Y Force, they would become legends of the Chinese resistance.
In May 1944, the battle for western Yunnan began. The 54th Army, 198th Division, led by General Wei Li Huang, the Chinese Expeditionary Force, advanced towards their first target, Tengchong. But before they could reach the enemy base, they had to cross the mighty Salween River and the nearly impassable Gaoligong Mountains. If they failed, China's resistance would be in grave danger. World War II has broken out, and China has been at war with Japan for 7 years. By 1944, Japan has occupied key Chinese territories, including its lifeline to the outside world, the Burma Road. To reclaim the road, the Chinese government decides to attack Japanese bases in western Yunnan and northern Burma. The Chinese Expeditionary Force begin their attack, advancing into Tengchong. Countless nameless soldiers died in the battle to regain the road. Their sacrifices have been documented in the collections of Duan Shenghui. A private collector, he's amassed a huge number of items left from the Yunnan-Burma battle.
Could you tell me why you decided to set up this museum in the first place?
是这样的，就是我从小就听着祖父这一辈人，讲日军占领的彭冲，杀人放火的这些故事，所以从小呢就有一个信心，就有一个目标，就是要把这些战争的这些遗物收藏起来，以一种物化的方式呢，让大家记住这段历史，让我们以后的人呢，这样来警醒这段历史。滇西战场呢，因为我们知道滇西啊都是那个浑淡山脉以下的，就是山川河流，所以高山阻碍，交通不便，这是我们最大的一个困难。第二个困难呢，就是当时盟国的支持。其实当时我们虽然签订了协议，在支持中是大打了折扣的。
With limited support from the Allies, the Chinese Expeditionary Army was stretched. But that was not the only difficulty they faced. To reach the Japanese, they had to cross the mighty Salween River. But the only route across, the Huitong Bridge, had been bombed by the Chinese army in 1942. to stop the Japanese from advancing into Yunnan through the Burma Road.
US Army blasting machine. Wow, amazing to think it was used at that time.
对，这个太重要了，因为它只是一个引爆剂啊，引爆炸弹，炸毁汇通桥以后，才把日本鬼子阻在怒江以西。主要是汇通桥啊，是当时整个滇缅公路的咽喉。如果那一个桥没有炸断，那么日军呢就会跨过桥来以后，那么宝山就沦陷，最后呢大理沦陷，昆明沦陷，整个中国的抗战可能就要这段历史就要重新改写。
Duan Shenghui's collections provide a window into China's past, and the artifacts remaining from the war showed just how brutal the battle was. Tengchong was finally won by the Chinese on the 14th of September 1944 in their campaign to regain control of the Burma Road. Another decisive battle was fought at Songshan. It was a major gateway for access to the road. 200,000 soldiers from the Chinese Expeditionary Force advanced into the Songshan mountain area. A bloody 3-month battle ensued. I'm on my way to meet 87-year-old veteran Li Wende, who fought in the Battle of Songshan at the age of 16. His memories of the war are crystal clear. Li was forcibly recruited to become part of the army while he was out working in the fields. After only a few months of training, he was sent to the front lines in the Battle of Songshan. What do you remember about the beginning of the Battle of Songshan?
日本飞机来得多啊，我们开上登上来第3天、第4天，跟日本飞机这个高速打小道一样，打个小卧飞机一样，放了大气嘛，个枪的炮的声音到炸弹的声音，这种嘛分不清了。
It must have been a very dramatic battle. Were there particular incidents that you remember?
松山背后那个黄土坡那边有一块地是比较重过，我们草是长得多深，我们这块地脚上就围着的铁丝网。再就是第二个阵地，在那个工事地箱间里头，它在那个洞子就蹲着了嘛，跨到林子田林子乡，我们到处去抓机枪啊，机枪子那嘎就相完人就干，比中一直比了半个多小时啊。一个人把铁丝剪那个铁丝网。这样子3个人嘛，就剪断3个铁丝，3个铁丝再拿个人转移，拿个铁丝网，就剪开这个拉头，然后拉开人就转移了。就从一个那个副连长给我上前，上去就拿先投了手榴弹投了以后就拿冲枪就打到进去嘛，日本人就想退了。等现在到了边头，那个副连长拿着枪上把地上站上去，再一摇紧，到海上来，就这样咵那什么好嘛噻，还不口子还不是日本人，我们去耍个一刀啊，耍人家往这刀，因为这个一个点位耍，因为这个好多嘛，下半是偏着玩嘛，好多嘛，偏山就归家了嘛，有多大地方整理去了。
It was very moving hearing Li Wende's stories. The last year of the war was a terrible time for the Chinese army. There was forced conscription, and there were low supplies of food and of weapons, and yet they still managed to win battles like Songshan. The trenches where Li and others fought still remain. They were an important part of Japanese strategy in the battle. After numerous attempts, the Chinese finally came up with an idea to destroy their forts. The Chinese faced some setbacks as the Japanese trenches and forts were very hard to penetrate. So they had to dig a tunnel through the mountain where the forts were located, 150 meters long. Then they packed the tunnel with explosives and blew up the fort. The Chinese military strategy had defeated Japanese morale.
Songshan was finally recaptured on the 7th of September 1944 at the cost of 7,600 Chinese soldiers and some 1,200 Japanese defenders. As a result, the Allies recaptured western Yunnan and northern Burma and regained the Burma Road. This also helped clear the way for a new Yunnan-Burma road, the Ledo Road, which was finally opened in January 1945. Thanks in significant part to the brave actions of the Chinese Expeditionary Force, the Battle of Songshan was an important turning point. 20,000 Chinese soldiers fought at the Battle of Songshan, and 8,000 were killed. These life-size statues commemorate the courage and contribution of these soldiers, which had been forgotten for so long. By the end of 1943, Japan knew the tide was turning against them. Allied assaults had cost them territories in the Pacific. To regain the initiative in the war, Japan would launch an unexpected battle with close to 500,000 troops. A final showdown that would define a nation. World War II has engulfed most of Europe. By 1944, China has been fighting a Japanese invasion for almost 8 years. The Japanese want to destroy US air bases in China, as well as open up land and rail lines to rescue isolated Japanese troops in Southeast Asia. In 1944, they launched Operation Ichigo. It's a huge thrust into central China that the Japanese hope will stretch the Chinese army beyond its limits and bring an end to China's resistance. This might be the final campaign. I'm on my way to Hunan province, where one of the fiercest acts of resistance to Operation Ichigo took place. After the fall of the provincial capital, Changsha, the Japanese moved on to the city of Hengyang. The Japanese were closing in on Hengyang, a major railway junction and gateway to the south. But something was in the way. 18,000 Chinese troops under General Fang Xuanjie were defending a small fortified base against an onslaught of more than 100,000 Japanese troops. 94-year-old Rao Pingru fought in the Battle of Hengyang. Hailing from a family of scholars and academics, Rao was the only one in his family who didn't follow that learned path. The war had started, and he felt he had no choice but to fight. What was your role in that battle, the Battle of Hengyang?
打汉阳的时候呢，是第10军被这个日本军队包围了，我们是100军奉这个命令去解救他，但是呢，就是20公里的地方就受到日本的阻拦，从早晨8点钟一直等到下午4、5点，还是没有办法打进去。我记得我那个时候夏天很口渴啊，想喝水，又不能离开部队，没有水。那个时候我们水壶都没有水壶的，我怎么办呢？又不能离开，就是旁边那个稻田呐，最少稻田里面，我就拿一个把茶杯大茶杯子，那个稻田的水舀一碗水，不吃不行呐，很难喝，我喝下去，解渴了。我在所在的这个100军呐，是 装备很差的，我讲个给你听，完全没有钢盔的，我们没有皮靴，没穿朝鲜，都是布的衣服，粗布衣服，枪还是很老式的，那个79步的汉阳造的，那是很早的这个枪，炮嘛就是这个配方，所以我们装备也好，武器也好都很差，跟日本比不好比。我们这个一个炮站，我是台长有2门炮啊，我就站在后面，这炮在前面，跟我只有大概只有5、6步吧，很近的。可是想不到啊，因为匆匆忙忙的那个第3炮手搞反，就交给去那个第2炮手了，那个很紧张嘛，往下一丢，这个炮弹就在炮弹里面炸了。配件炮的炮膛啊，这个厚度啊，钢啊，有这么厚啊，分碎块啊，杀过来的。这个第1炮手是什么跪下来的？第2炮手是跪左腿，这个第1炮手这个腿没有了，第2炮手这个腿没有了，一个左腿，大家抬住他，他怎么讲？他说：“台长，你枪毙我吧！”他痛苦，他要结束他的生命了，叫我枪毙他，很惨痛。怎么办？我们当时没有什么，怎么办？我也没办法，就是把这2个兵呐抬着后方去。我估计是肯定是活不成。
Although they actually won the Battle of Hengyang, the Japanese suffered tremendous casualty. Over 9,000 Japanese soldiers were killed during the attack on the city, compared with 1,000 for the battle for Malaysia and Singapore. As far as Japan was concerned, it had suffered a tremendous blow. This was actually one of the single longest offences of any one city during the war years. And although the Battle for Hengyang was small scale, it embodied the spirit of the war, resistance until the end. More battles followed after Hengyang. By 1945, the Japanese held territories from the northeast all the way to the south. But they didn't have enough military force to control the countryside. While the nationalist military defended China's interior, Mao's 8th Route and new 4th Armies recruited peasants behind Japanese lines to join the conflict. They infiltrated Japanese-held territories in northern China, using guerrilla tactics to help cut off Japanese traffic and supplies. Resistance was growing as the Communist Army expanded. Most Chinese assumed that the war would continue for 1 or 2 years. Nobody expected that it would end as abruptly as it had started. On 6th of August 1945, the US dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, and another 3 days later on Nagasaki. Japan surrendered unconditionally to the Allies. China had huge military disadvantages, yet the Chinese turned what the Japanese military had assumed would be a 3-month campaign into a war of attrition lasting until September the 2nd, 1945. The following day is now known as China's Victory Day. The Japanese surrender to China took place at the Central Military Academy in Nanjing. On the 9th of September 1945, at 9 o'clock in the morning, General He Ying-chin and Lieutenant General Okamura Yasujiro, representing their respective governments, signed the Act of Surrender. The simple 20-minute ceremony marked the end of 8 long years of war. China's World War II was the longest and one of the bloodiest. The war cost China some 14 million or more lives and destroyed the flawed but real modernization that the country had been going through. You can see China's spirit of resistance here at the Liberation Monument in the center of Chongqing, the former wartime capital. the city never fell as the Chinese continued to defend themselves. They also pinned down some 600,000 of the 2.3 million overseas Japanese troops, making China a crucial part of the overall Allied strategy.
The council was briefed this morning by...
And as a direct result, today China has a seat in the Permanent Five on the United Nations Security Council, the pinnacle of global diplomacy. But the ghosts of the war with Japan haven't been laid to rest. For the survivors I've met throughout my journey, the horrors of war linger in their memories.
一生一世都不会忘记，因为那是生与死的一个界限。
But it's obvious that the spirit of resilience and desire for peace has prevailed above all else.
我希望我们人们不要忘记这一段历史，要反对战争，要珍爱和平。
China survived World War II and has emerged as a leading world power, but not without the sacrifices of those who fought for freedom against all odds.